There are exactly 10 car chases on this list, and every single one of them was built without green screen, without CGI, and without miniatures. Just real cars, real streets, and drivers who probably had better judgment in every other area of their lives. We're talking about a sequence filmed at 90 miles per hour through live Brooklyn traffic with zero police control, a 40-minute destruction derby that consumed 93 actual vehicles, and a stunt woman who strapped herself to the hood of a moving car with nothing but a pair of fastening belts and what can only be described as extraordinary confidence. Whether these chases were dangerous isn't the question. The question is how any sane production allowed them to happen at all? The one that started everything is also the one everybody gets slightly wrong. Here's the detail that almost nobody walking into a cinema in October 1968 would have known. Warner Brothers had a promotional arrangement with Ford, and that arrangement came with a condition. Steve McQueen's character would drive a Ford Galaxy sedan with the hitmen pursuing him in another Galaxy. Two full-size American family cars, lumbering over the hills of San Francisco. The cars were sourced, the paperwork was signed, and then someone actually tried to drive them over the famous hill jumps. The suspension bottomed out on both. They barely cleared the crests. Ford reluctantly agreed to a substitution, and a pair of 1968 Mustang GT390 Fastbacks were sourced, painted Highland green, and handed to veteran racer Max Balchowski, who spent weeks rebuilding them from the wheels up. Reinforced suspension mounts, Coney shocks, heavy-duty coil springs, Magnafluxed components, roll cages fitted invisibly inside the cabin. The 390 cubic inch FEV8 producing 325 horsepower stayed largely intact. The car that defined a generation of chase filmmaking existed because two Galaxies couldn't handle a hill. Director Peter Yates called for speeds of around 75 to 80 miles per hour during filming, and what he actually got was consistently north of 110. Stunt driver Bud Ekins handled most of the demanding wheel work in the Highland green Mustang GT390 Fastback, while Bill Hickman piloted the opposing 1968 Dodge Charger, which carried a 440 cubic inch engine producing 375 horsepower and was, by any objective measure, the faster car. Hickman later admitted he spent most of the sequence lifting off the throttle deliberately, because the Charger would otherwise have simply disappeared into the distance. That sense of constant menace in the chase, the feeling that the black Dodge is always right there and always capable of ending it, was manufactured entirely by a stunt driver choosing to go slower than the machine beneath him could manage. Composer Lalo Schifrin delivered a full score for the sequence, and Yates listened to it carefully before pulling every note. No music, just 390 and 440 cubic inches screaming across San Francisco concrete, which turned out to be a more persuasive argument than anything an orchestra could provide. The surviving hero Mustang GT390 Fastback sold at Meekham's Kissimmee auction in January 2020 for $3.74 million, confirmed as the most expensive Mustang ever sold at auction at that time, while the stunt car spent decades listed as destroyed before resurfacing in Mexico in 2017. The chase that almost starred two family sedans, shot with cars that weren't supposed to exist in this film, built by a man given a few weeks and a very specific problem to solve, remains the reference point that everything else gets measured against. William Friedkin filmed this chase without permission, and he knew exactly what he was doing. The city of New York reviewed the proposed route running under the BMT West End Line elevated track in Bensonhurst and declined to issue permits, citing the danger. Friedkin hired off-duty NYPD officers to close the streets themselves, positioned a camera in the back seat of a commandeered 1971 Pontiac LeMans, and had stunt driver Bill Hickman drive it at 90 miles per hour through populated Brooklyn while real pedestrians scattered out of the path of a car they hadn't been warned about. Several collisions occurred during filming. The public was never informed that a film production was happening. The 1971 Pontiac LeMans, at the center of the sequence, carries no glamour, and that's entirely the point. It's a civilian vehicle, grabbed off the street by a desperate cop, being driven in a manner no civilian vehicle was designed to handle. And Friedkin shot the whole thing from inside it. He was in that back seat at speed, feeling every crack in the Brooklyn asphalt, and that physical presence translates directly to what you see on screen. You'd think a sequence assembled without permits, without formal stunt coordination, and without studio oversight would look rough and improvised. And it does look rough and improvised, which is precisely why it works. The French Connection won Best Picture at the 44th Academy Awards in April 1972, becoming the first R-rated film to do so since the MPAA rating system was introduced. Friedkin confirmed years later that the chase was entirely invented. that the real case it was based on involved nothing remotely like it, and that without a genuine action sequence, the film would have amounted to surveillance footage. He wasn't wrong about any of that. H.B. Halicki wrote the film, directed it, produced it, starred in it, and then climbed into the cars himself. Released in 1974, Gone in 60 Seconds features the longest car chase in film history at the time of release, running approximately 40 continuous minutes, during which 93 vehicles were destroyed. And it was built around a 1971 Ford Mustang Sportsroof that Halicki painted school bus yellow and modified with a 1973 grille to make it read as a newer model on screen. That Mustang Sportsroof, which Halicki renamed Eleanor, received 250 hours of bespoke preparation. A full roll cage, a transmission chained in place for structural safety, and an adjustable camera mount fitted in the rear. The car was built to survive what Halicki was about to ask of it. The climactic jump cleared 30 feet of air over 128 feet of distance, and Halicki performed it himself. The landing compacted 10 of his vertebrae. The account from the crew is that when he regained consciousness, his first concern was whether they had captured sufficient coverage, and that filming resumed approximately 3 weeks later, with Halicki working in a full leg cast with broken ribs. That's not the kind of dedication that fits neatly into a production anecdote. It's something considerably stranger than that. Halicki passed away in August 1989 while preparing stunt work for a sequel, at which point he had already sourced 400 crash-ready vehicles for the production. The original Eleanor Mustang Sportsroof survived and remains in the Halicki estate's possession. That jump, performed once on a real freeway by the director himself, has never been matched for sheer unmediated audacity. The finale of the Blues Brothers involved 13 Bluesmobiles, 60 police cars, and a final tally of 103 vehicles written off during production, with director John Landis dropping a Pinto from a helicopter at 1,200 feet for a single shot because apparently that seemed like the proportionate response. The hero cars throughout the film were genuine 1974 Dodge Monaco police interceptors sourced from decommissioned fleet stock, which gives the whole enterprise a pleasing circularity. The car carrying the anti-authority heroes through an elaborate sequence of law enforcement destruction had, until recently, been law enforcement property. The stunt work in this film tends to get underestimated because audiences remember the comedy and file the physical sequences under spectacle rather than craft. One particular moment involves the Bluesmobile, launching over a police cruiser and barely clipping the siren light on the way over, a stunt the driver agreed to attempt only after Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi each offered him a personal $1,000 incentive on top of his rate. Two actors, essentially crowdfunding a specific level of danger from their own pockets because the moment required it. The 1974 Dodge Monaco Bluesmobile didn't need computer assistance. It needed two actors willing to reach into their wallets at the right moment. John Frankenheimer directed Ronin at 68 years old and approached the question of digital shortcuts with a clarity that left little room for discussion. His instruction to the production was unambiguous. We didn't use any of that computer échec. Shooting the entire film at 24 frames per second, rather than the lower frame rates that allow editors to accelerate footage artificially in post-production, meant the cars on screen actually had to reach the speeds the camera recorded. Certain sequences required vehicles exceeding 120 miles per hour on closed Paris streets, and the production sourced 4 BMW 535i sedans and 5 Peugeot 406 to absorb the demands of filming, with 80 cars written off across the whole production. One of each car was cut in half lengthwise and towed by a Mercedes-Benz 500EE, so the actors could sit inside a vehicle that appeared to be moving while remaining stationary relative to the tow car. And right-hand drive versions of both the BMW 535i and Peugeot 406 were purchased separately and fitted with dummy left-side steering wheels to maintain the illusion of driver control. The stunt team included Formula One driver Jean-Pierre Jarier, alongside LeMans winners Jean-Claude Lanier and Michel Neugarten. On a $55 million budget, the film returned $70.7 million worldwide in nominal 1998 figures, excluding marketing, Norsapo, which represented a commercial underperformance that didn't diminish the sequence's influence by a single frame. Frankenheimer stated before production that he intended to create a chase that would make directors reconsider attempting another one. He was right, though the directors who followed largely reached for render farms anyway. Quentin Tarantino made Death Proof as a direct response to 1970s stunt cinema, and stuntwoman Zoe Bell performed the hood sequence personally with no double and no CGI, clinging to the bonnet of a 1970 Dodge Challenger R/T on a Tennessee highway using 2 luggage straps while the car ran at pursuit speed. Bell's own description of what she did leaves no interpretive room. There's no double, there's no CGI, it's all practical. Kurt Russell's antagonist drove a 1969 Dodge Charger, and the climax becomes a high-speed argument between 2 pieces of American muscle from the same era, on a real road, at real speed, with a real human being physically present on the exterior of the faster car. Tarantino shot the entire sequence in clear daylight with no atmospheric manipulation, no filters, no conditions engineered to make the footage more cinematic. He wanted it to look exactly like what it was. And in 2007, when every other major action sequence in Hollywood was leaning harder into digital assistance, that decision to strip everything back and present the thing plainly was more radical than it might appear. The 1970 Dodge Challenger R/T has serious cinematic lineage, most directly from Vanishing Point a year after the car's original production run, and Tarantino understood that the car carried a specific weight of association that required no amplification. The realism was the spectacle. Nothing else needed adding. George Miller made the Road Warrior outside Broken Hill, New South Wales, on a production budget of approximately 4 million Australian dollars, with a skeleton crew, a stunt team operating under conditions that contemporary productions would not sanction, and a collection of purpose-built vehicle rigs assembled in the desert and driven as hard as the terrain allowed. Several incidents occurred on set during filming, and the production continued. The approach was uncomplicated. Put real vehicles in real desert, drive them at genuine speed, and point cameras at the results. The hero vehicle, Max's 1973 Ford Falcon X BGT Coupe, carried a supercharged V8 and the distinctive body modifications that made it immediately recognizable, most notably the blower protruding through the bonnet, which became one of the most replicated automotive images in the history of action cinema. The tanker convoy vehicles were sourced from Australian fleet stock and modified with armor plating and exterior mounting rigs, so that stunt performers could be carried on the outside of moving vehicles at speed, producing footage that required no digital enhancement because the people on screen were actually out there, at those speeds, on that road. The Interceptor was destroyed on screen at the film's conclusion, though a surviving example has been displayed at various events in Australia in recent years. Mad Max: Fury Road in 2015 extended Miller's legacy with a production that prioritized practical work in ways that separated it from most of its contemporaries, but confirmed CGI enhancements place it in a different category. The Road Warrior remains the purest version of what Miller was doing in 1981. No safety nets in the conventional sense, no digital cleanup after the fact, just the Broken Hill Desert and whatever the camera captured when the vehicles reached speed on that road. Friedkin again, because of course it's Friedkin again. The Wrong Way freeway sequence in To Live and Die in LA was filmed on an active Los Angeles freeway, traveling against oncoming traffic cleared by law enforcement within a brief and precisely managed road closure window, using 1985 Ford Taurus sedans, fitted with no meaningful modifications for the stunt, no engine upgrades, no specialized rigging. Just a freeway, the wrong direction, and a production team that understood exactly what the camera would capture if the conditions were genuine. Coming 4 years after The French Connection, Friedkin already had a clear understanding of what unmanaged velocity looks like on film, and the freeway sequence in To Live and Die in LA applies that understanding to a different setting with the same underlying logic: real location, real speed, real consequences if anything goes wrong. The film tends to be undervalued in the practical effects conversation, partly because it arrived between 2 distinct eras of action cinema and landed in an uncomfortable gap. That freeway sequence is genuinely alarming in a way that rendered expressways simply cannot replicate, because the margin for error on an actual freeway going the wrong direction is not a number that benefits from close examination. Hal Needham had never directed a feature film before Smokey and the Bandit, a fact that becomes more interesting when you consider that it grossed over $127 million at the domestic box office in 1977 on a production budget of $4.3 million, excluding marketing costs, finishing second only to Star Wars that year. Needham had spent his career as one of Hollywood's most experienced stunt performers, and when he spotted an advertisement for the upcoming 1977 Pontiac Trans Am, he contacted Pontiac directly, arranged a deal, and secured 4 of them for the production. What Pontiac actually delivered were 1976 model cars, fitted with 1977 front ends specifically for filming, carrying a 400 cubic inch Pontiac Vive 8, producing around 200 horsepower, detuned from its earlier specifications by emissions regulations. But here's the thing nobody mentions. That distinctive engine growl running through the entire film doesn't belong to the Trans Am at all. It was recorded from a heavily modified 1955 Chevrolet 150 fitted with a 454 cubic inch engine, the same sound rig used previously on Two-Lane Blacktop and American Graffiti, and nobody involved with the production thought to publicize this for years. Pontiac Trans Am sales nearly doubled within 2 years of the film's release, driven partly by an engine sound the car didn't actually make. 3 of the 4 Trans Ams were destroyed during production, with only the promotional car surviving. Now owned by Gene Kennedy and touring the country as of recent years, Needham directed one of the decade's most commercially successful films using cars that weren't quite what they appeared to be, powered on screen by a sound that came from somewhere else entirely. And in Hollywood, that distinction between appearance and reality has always been considered a professional skill rather than a problem. Doug Liman gave his stunt team a red Mini Cooper S and a mandate to do something that felt genuinely out of control. The 2002 Mini Cooper S is a small, front-wheel drive hatchback carrying a 1.6-liter supercharged engine producing 163 horsepower, which is not the profile of a traditional action vehicle, and in the narrow stone alleyways of the Paris Latin Quarter, that relative modesty becomes the entire point. The sequence involves the Mini Cooper S descending an actual flight of stone steps at speed, a stunt requiring specific suspension reinforcement to handle the impact load, and a driver working with effectively zero lateral margin on either side. 4 years earlier, Ronin had staged a chase through Paris with BMW 535i sedans, driven by racing drivers at 120 miles per hour, and you'd think that would make a small hatchback on cobblestones feel anticlimactic by comparison. The opposite is true. Scale doesn't determine whether a sequence works. Consequence does. And the Mini Cooper S in the Latin Quarter works because the walls are real, the staircase is real, the cobblestones produce a genuine surface on which a car behaves unpredictably, and the margin between executing the stunt and collecting a stone wall is narrow enough to be uncomfortable to watch. No visual effects department narrowed those alleys after the fact. The Mini Cooper S fits into those spaces because that's how wide those spaces actually are. Every film on this list made the same fundamental choice at some point in production: to point the camera at something real and accept the outcome. No post-production correction available if the sequence didn't work. No second chance built into the render pipeline. The cars existed, the roads existed, and what happened when they met at speed was what ended up on screen. That shared commitment is what separates these sequences from the majority of what followed them. And it's why stunt coordinators still reach for these films when they're trying to explain to a studio why practical work produces something that a render farm cannot replicate. CGI can simulate anything with sufficient budget and time. What it cannot simulate is the physical fact that something actually happened, and an audience, without necessarily knowing why, can feel that difference in a theater seat. If that distinction between what's real and what's rendered is something that draws you in, this channel is exactly where that conversation keeps going.